about the generational shift, and particularly about China, because up until I started reading your stuff, I was in the bandwagon of China being the next great superpower, right? That it was going to finally take over. Internal consumption was going to replace exporting consumption, and what? Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you see the demographic shifts in China, and what your perspective of the future of China is versus that narrative?
Well, I don't think the two are necessarily incompatible. I mean, I still think you can have a scenario. I mean, because I think Rodrigo and I, we kind of grew up, I think, in the same early 2000s, rise of the BRICS. Especially in the US, you guys were kind of shielded by the illusion of, the US is special. But for foreigners, it was so clear to us that, we were moving to a multipolar world, that, the emerging middle class, all that stuff. And yeah, I think in the past 10 years, we've had to rethink a lot of these assumptions, right? I mean, the Brazilian middle class, they really exist? Probably not. The China's growth, double-digit growth, is it real? Is it not? Yada yada. And yeah, so the demography in China is basically starting 81, 82, you get a one-child policy, and it was very hardly implemented in cities, a little less in the countryside, but you go from 4 or 5 kids a woman to 1. I mean, this is something you cannot undo. And then even when they undid it in 2016, the birth rates are still close to 1. And even places that didn't have the one-child policy, like Taiwan and South Korea, they did on their own because of things like education, cost of housing. I mean, that's not just the government mandate. So that is going to be a huge break on growth. But again, I would argue there is some room to go. They were growing at 7-8%. So even if it slows to 3 or 4, that's still somewhat better than the US. You can grow, as you were pointing out, that the share of the consumption pie, which is less than 50% of GDP, is ridiculous. In the US, you have 80% of your GDP is domestic consumption. In China, it's 50. So just by increasing that share of the pie, you can have growth. Actually, for most of the GDP growth that we see in China, is if it's surpluses, it means consumed by other people. Like, it's not real growth for them. Like, oh wow, I'm great, we're growing at 10%. That means that the Americans are buying a lot of stuff at Walmart. That doesn't make you feel all that great, right? So I think I still kind of remain in the camp just because of the scale. I mean, China is 1.2 billion people. The US is 380. I mean, I think all they have to do is become half as rich as the Americans, and it will be by far the largest economy in the world. So I still think it's going to happen.
How will they adapt to the demographic cliff, though? Especially if you consider that, much like Japan, China is somewhat of a closed society. You don't get a lot of influx. You don't have a lot of immigration coming in, whereas in the U.S., you have a lot of immigration. Like it's what you hear. Everybody wants to come into the U.S. Everybody wants to migrate to the U.S. You don't hear a lot of people wanting to migrate to China or to Japan to a large extent. So, do you see this demographic replenishment perhaps serving as a counterbalance to your view?
Yeah, I think that historically been very correct. I mean, that's been really I would argue the 3 advantages of the U.S. status as a superpower are, first, this kind of amazing geography that it has, especially when you compare to Europe. I mean, they're not neighbored by Russia, Turkey, and Africa. I mean, they have Canada and Mexico. That's pretty big. They have big rivers. I mean, all of that stuff, right? Then they issue the world reserve currency, and on top of that, they get this rent really of really smart, educated people who typically move when they're ready to work. So you don't have to pay for their expense, right? They move at 25, and then quite often they even retire in their own country. So you really squeeze in. It's like a tax on the rest of the world. I mean, this is how empires work, by the way. I mean, empires extract wealth from the periphery and they bring it to the center, and the U.S. has done that since its foundation, really, and it's done that better than any other country in the world. Now, I would say on the margin, I think the tolerance for immigration in the U.S. is going down, or in the West in general. I mean, especially in Europe. So, the hope that we can outsource our demographic crisis to foreigners, I think, is not possible. Also, because you'd have to let in a lot more. As the internal demographic degrade, you need to get 2-3% of annual migration, and I think we reach, especially in Europe, I think we reached a breaking point. I don't think it's racist to say that. I mean, people just don't want any more foreigners to come in Europe, even though the economy needs it. I mean, that was the whole debate around Merkel and getting the Syrian immigrants. I mean, Merkel was giving the view of the German establishment, like the German manufacturing. And he was like, okay, we need X million workers to keep the car production afloat. And then the population said, no, we stop here.
They're poorly
There's a cultural
assimilated in
loss
Europe
that
to
is
a large
made.
degree.
Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead.
In Europe, the immigrants tend not to be quite assimilated. You see this particularly in France, and all the social convulsion that we've seen in France. Whereas in the U.S., I think the Latino communities, which are a large influx of the immigrants, tend to blend much better into the society. But I'm still thinking about how this contrasts with the two Asian superpowers, China and Japan, and the lack of this immigration flow,
Right.
and how that will eventually lead China to grow old before it grows rich,
Right.
and Japan to continue to age and to continue to face the difficulties.
My impression of Japan is that they're kind of okay with this kind of managed decline. I don't know how long it can last, but because your population is shrinking, even zero growth, you increase per capita income. And actually, if you look, real per capita income, because of the foreign population, the fall of inflation, Japan's performance has been very comparable to that of Germany, of Canada, and the US over the past 20 years. So when we say last decades, no, like living standards, I mean, Japan is still a very comfortable place to live. It's a very safe place to live. They have low, I mean, it's not a... if you do a chart of nominal GDP, of course, it looks awful, especially with the fall of the yen lately. But
Per capita,
yes, per capita real. I think it's not. I don't know if that's sustainable or not. I think we're kind of testing that now with this inflationary shock. We'll see what happens. But so far, I think that's been the case. As far as China, time will tell. China has been an empire before. China is a very diverse, multi-ethnic country with, already within what we call China, hundreds of ethnic groups. I would not necessarily write it off as again, this is the path of empires. Empires attract from the periphery, squeeze in, and if China is to be a successful empire, it will have to do that.